and welcome to Aviation Deep Dive. Japanese designs in the Second World War are generally remembered for their excellent maneuverability and their dominance during the early years of the war. Many would say, however, that the numerous aviation companies in Japan would produce their best designs with their backs up against the wall during the later years of the war. When the Boeing B-29 undertook their first raids on the Japanese home islands in June 1944, the home industry immediately realized the need for a high-altitude, fast, and heavily armed interceptor capable of taking down the enormous American bombers. Nakajima was amongst the first to start work on this concept, the fruit of which would be the largely forgotten Ki-87, a turbo-supercharged, heavily armed fighter designed for extreme speeds at high altitudes. The roots of this aircraft, however, actually go back to long before B-29s even flew in early 1942. Nakajima and the technical division of Imperial Army Headquarters had been experimenting with fitting a large radial engine with an exhaust-driven turbo supercharger, the results of which were eventually poured into development of the ill-fated Tachikawa Ki-94. Nakajima, meanwhile, was instructed to work on their own design that would be based off the technology developed from the research. Their design would be a Plan B, a fallback if the Ki-94 project turned out to be a failure. At the time, Japanese officials were getting increasingly spooked at the prospect of American aircraft technology. It had become known by 1943 that the B-29 could fly at altitudes of up to 10,000 meters, but when it appeared over Tokyo at that altitude and the same year, it was flying so fast that the Ki-44, an interceptor introduced into Japanese service less than a year before, could not even come close to catching up. The J-2M4, J-2M5, and N-1K5 fighters that were designed to counter the threat were not even close to production. Nakajima, meanwhile, had put together a design, outlining a low-wing, fairly large interceptor with an externally mounted turbo supercharger and a deadly proposed armament of twin 30mm cannons and twin 20mm cannons. The aircraft would also have a central bomb rack capable of carrying up to a single 250kg bomb for multi-role capabilities. Construction of the aircraft, dubbed the Ki-87, began in July 1943, but immediately ran into issues. The starboard externally mounted turbo supercharger was favored by Nakajima engineers, as it was considered that placing it ventrally would risk putting it in contact with fuel, which would be an enormous fire risk. The Imperial Japanese Army, meanwhile, apparently disagreed and insisted on the ventral placement. Ultimately, after many delays and disagreements between Nakajima and the IGA, the engineers were proved right, and the turbo supercharger was moved back to its original place. But precious months had been wasted, especially when considering there were many other issues to contend with. The technology was new and extensive testing had to be done. By March 1944, the B-29 raids on Japan were imminent, and the Tachikawa Ki-94 had been a disappointment. The pressurization system had turned out to be extremely heavy and complicated, both compromising the expected performance of the design and creating a maintenance nightmare for ground crews. Desperate attention was turned to the Ki-87, with slightly relaxed requirements and a request for a simplified and lighter pressurization system. Nakajima was awarded a contract to build 3 prototypes and 7 pre-production aircraft to be completed between November 1944 and January 1945, with the expectation that serial production would begin around February 1945. Construction would be fairly protracted, however. Issues with the electrical undercarriage retracting system, as well as with continued disagreements as to the optimal position of the turbo supercharger, delaying final assembly. The engine decided on powering the aircraft would be the Nakajima HA-219RU, although of course, like most Japanese equipment, it was given a different designation by the manufacturer and different military branches. It was also known as the Ha-44 Model 11. This late-war Japanese 18-cylinder engine would give 2,400 horsepower at sea level for takeoff power, and paired with the turbo supercharger, would still be pumping out over 1,850 horsepower at 10.5 kilometers of altitude. The engine was certainly powerful, but would present its own issues, being maintenance heavy, and ultimately only around 10 were actually built. The four-bladed constant-speed propeller was also very large, necessitating pretty large gear legs for ground clearance. Regardless, the Ki-87 prototype was finally finished, fully constructed by February 1945, and after some ground testing, underwent its first flight in April at the Nakajima testing facility.
Battery on. 点火コイル on. 計器板の電源 on. 第一エンジンの燃料バルブオープン。電動燃料ポンプ on. ポンピング中。マグネット1および2。完成フライホイールオン。クラッチ接続。エンジンオン。飛行場へ移動開始。離陸の準備。スロットルアップ。
One issue that had yet to be fully resolved, however, was to do with the undercarriage. Operated electrically, they were plagued by failures and simply were not reliable enough to trust for the aircraft's maiden flight, and thus were left in a lockdown position. The aircraft demonstrated generally good flying characteristics, considering that the entire flight was done with the gear down, although at 5,600 kilograms, or about 12,400 pounds when fully loaded, the Ki-87 was quite heavy for an aircraft of its role, indebted no doubt to the large turbo supercharging system. The Interceptor was also projected to have a maximum speed of 706 kilometers an hour at 11,000 meters, although it would take about 14 minutes to climb to that altitude. The preliminary tests were considered generally successful, apart from the obvious undercarriage issues, and full production for 500 examples of the aircraft was planned. However, at this point, the war was in dire straits for Japan. The battle for Okinawa was raging, but the US were getting closer and closer to mainland Japan, and bombing raids on the Japanese mainland had been catastrophic for the native industry. The Japanese had needed these 500 Ki-87s, piloted by experienced crews, a year earlier. The single prototype was simply too little too late. Over the course of the next few weeks, the Ki-87 underwent a further 4 test flights, none of them particularly long, and all of them with the unreliable undercarriage extended. Further upgrades of the Ki-87 had been planned by Nakajima, namely the Dash 2 variant, which would be powered by a 3,000 horsepower Ha-46 engine, but this never left the design stage. As it was, the Ki-87 had not reached readiness for serial production by the time of the Japanese surrender on the 2nd of September 1945, and it had in fact been grounded for months beforehand. Left abandoned at the Shofu Air Base in Japan, the sole prototype was discovered by the Americans, where it was photographed, and this is unfortunately where all the information that I can find dries up. There doesn't appear to be any evidence of evaluation by the Americans, and I can only assume it was scrapped shortly thereafter. This photo shows the aircraft on the tarmac at the abandoned airbase in Shofu. The Ki-87 is a pretty fascinating glimpse into late-war Japanese aviation industry. It's got the sleek lines of a late-war fighter with armament to match, though ultimately with just one prototype produced, and without even being close to seeing service, the aircraft has been almost completely forgotten, and relegated to barely a footnote in history. I could only find one historical book that even mentioned it. A huge thanks to my patrons on screen now for supporting the channel, and thank you so much for watching this video of Aviation Deep Dive. Consider liking and subscribing for more weekly content, and please also consider supporting us on Patreon. See you in the skies.